It's hard to think of a time in American history that has been idealized more than the 1800s prairie. The thought makes me think of brave travelers blazing trails through the West and happy families cuddled up in log cabins. A lot of us wish there were times when we could also be pioneers. After all, their lives were easy, satisfying, and not complicated like ours, which are full of work and technology. But this made-up picture of life on the prairie couldn't be more different from the truth. Homesteading was hard, lonely, dangerous, and not very exciting. There were not many nice things, and a lot of bad things. The Happy Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder and the old-school Oregon Trail game don't show the whole story of life on the frontier. To make the picture look better, unpleasant facts are left out or lightly touched on, so it's time to clear up the misunderstandings. Here are 10 reasons why life on the American border was really bad. Housing was inadequate. A homesteader had 5 years to prove up and build a house on the land they claimed. But most residents didn't have much money, and half of them lost their claims before 5 years were up. This meant that affordability was the most important thing when building the first homes. Also, there were few or no trees in many places, and houses were made of sod instead of wood. Soddies were dark, full of bugs and other pests, and often leaked or caved in when it rained. In places with lots of trees, people chose to live in log houses, but they were not at all cozy. It was hard on the body to build houses. Men would have to use only an axe to cut down trees and gather a lot of stone for the base and fireplace. Logs were up to 500 pounds, 227 kilograms, each, and many men had to lift them without any help. When they were finished, cabins had one room that was 10 by 20 feet, 3 by 6 meters, and had a sleeping loft. The cabins were 6 to 10 feet tall, 2 to 3 meters, depending on how many men helped them build them and lift the logs higher. The floors were dirty, and putting glass in the windows could take years. Because there wasn't much room, the kids had to share a single bed in the loft, while their parents slept on the bed below them. A blanket was put over most of the beds, which were just planks or straw. The furniture was very basic and not very comfy. Pioneer families had as many as 10 children, and all of their indoor activities took place in one room. This meant that private and personal space were unreal. Winters were brutal. The notion that frontier cabins were warm and cozy throughout the winter months is just another fallacy regarding these structures. The walls of the hut did not offer any insulation and only provided a slight windbreak. Consequently, the temperature inside was just as low as it was outside. Due to the fact that the heated air would escape, fires are not very effective at heating the room. There was a modest increase in insulation offered by soddies. However, it was important to note that their roofs would leak if it rained or snowed. It was of the utmost importance to maintain the fire, as it was the sole source of warmth, notwithstanding the deficiencies that it possessed. If a family wanted to have a fire during the entire winter, they would need to have a stockpile of wood that was as huge as the cabin itself. Homesteaders on the prairies, where wood was scarce and precious, resorted to using dried buffalo excrement, also known as buffalo chips, as a source of fuel. Despite this, the fire was not much more than a slight consolation against the biting cold, and winters were a difficult and dismal time of year. Horrible deaths and disease were common, having one's body crushed by a wagon load. Your swing with an axe didn't go as planned. You were hunting when you were assaulted by a wild animal, and before you could finish the lengthy process of reloading your gun, you were immediately attacked. As a result of the hazardous nature of life on a homestead, incidents of this kind were extremely prevalent. In addition, because of the close quarters in which families lived in the frontier, it was very inevitable that the remainder of the family would catch an illness if one member of the family became ill. There were instances in which a single disease may wipe out numerous children in a single family. This was not an unheard of occurrence. When wagon trains were in operation, hundreds of people would share a single water supply. which resulted in a high incidence of diseases caused by pollution, such as cholera and dysentery. A dysentery is not a laughing matter. It is a condition that causes diarrhea that is so severe that it can result in death due to dehydration in only a few hours. Tragically, when a wagon train was stricken by sickness, the deceased would be interred in graves that were only a few inches deep. Families would never have the opportunity to visit their loved ones because the bodies would be dug up by wolves. You would likely never see family again. When a pioneer family made the decision to leave their home, they did so with the awareness that it was highly likely that they would never see their previous family members and friends again. A lament on the difficulty of leaving and being away from family is a consistent element in first-hand stories of pioneers, particularly women. This is especially true of women and their experiences. Work was required on a daily basis to tend to the land, and traveling by wagon took so much time that there was no prospect of taking holidays to visit family and friends back home. Homesteaders were allowed to send mail back to their families, but because travel was so slow, it may take up to 6 months to receive a response of any kind. Loneliness and depression were incredibly common. It was extremely difficult for pioneers to interact with people who were not members of their families. A continual amount of work was required to maintain the home, and there was very little time left over for visiting neighbors. Furthermore, people lived in homes that were physically separated from one another. In accordance with the Homestead Act of 1862, married couples were each given 320 acres, and their dwellings were required to be located a half-mile apart from one another. There were sporadic gatherings of the community, such as quilting bees, but during the winter, when it was too cold to leave the house, those rare possibilities were no longer available. In particular, women were more likely to experience feelings of loneliness because their employment mostly focused on the home and consumed the all of their day. According to numerous first-person testimonies, it is quite probable that a significant number of homesteaders would be diagnosed with depression in the present day. This is despite the fact that mental health was not well known in the 1800s. Your whole day was chores. Since pioneers' lives were filled with work, it's not surprising that they got depressed. Most of the day was spent making sure their family had food. Midwest land was known for being very hard to grow crops on, and crops had to be worked on all the time to make sure they survived. Men would hunt and take care of the farm during the day, while women would gather plants, cook and store food, and do other jobs around the house. To get through the winter, you had to store enough food. It took hours to can fruits. Meat would either be salted and brined, which meant it had to be cleaned very carefully before being eaten, or smoked, which meant a fire had to be kept going for weeks. Pioneer women spent a lot of time tending to fires because they had to be adjusted all the time to keep them hot enough. In addition to housework, women were expected to make, clean, and take care of animals. Pioneers didn't have sewing tools, so they had to sew and fix clothes by hand. People did their laundry in a tub with a washboard because there were no vacuums or running water to make jobs easy. It could take hours and was usually unpleasant work to milk the cows, clean the barn, and feed the animals. There were no breaks or holidays, and there wasn't much time for nice things. Every day, they slogged through chores because they knew that tomorrow would bring more work. Starvation was frequent. Pioneers would sell their crops for money that they could spend at the general store. This let them buy things like flour that they needed every day, as well as coffee and white sugar that they wanted every once in a while. To save money, general shops would often cut their stock and fill the gaps with filler like plaster or sawdust. However, many pioneers lived so far from town that they only went on trading trips twice a year, and if crops were bad, there might not have been much to sell. Things that were nice were hard to come by, and it was tough to pay for things like clothes, farming tools, food, and other basics. Usually, these food shortages were caused by things that the pioneers couldn't change. crop yields could be destroyed by droughts and bands of locusts. In 1874, the plains were covered in a swarm of 12 trillion locusts that were so thick that they blocked out the sky. In just a few hours, they ate whole fields of crops, leaving homesteaders with nothing to eat or sell. These things could not be fixed no matter how hard you worked. The results would just have to be dealt with. Water was gross and hard to come by. Getting water could be hard if you weren't lucky enough to get a plot by a river early on. At first, most settlers decided to dig wells near their homes. When the well did reach water, though, seepage from the outhouse and barn would make it into the groundwater and make it dirty. This meant that water had to be boiled before it could be used, which was a slow process because it was hard to keep fires going. The water would be topped off with rainwater. Mosquitoes and dirt would land on the buckets, so they had to be cleaned before they could be used. Most families had to go to water sources every day to get fresh water, which took hours and added to their daily work. Even so, many homes didn't have enough water, so cleanliness was pushed to the back burner in order to save it. Once a week, the same water would be used for cleaning and bathing for the whole family. Plates were not washed, but licked clean. It's easy to forget how important clean, easy-to-reach water was to people who lived on their own. Dealing with waste was disgusting. When towns in Eastern America were putting in sewers and wealthy families had plumbing inside their homes, homesteading families had to make do with outhouses in their backyards. Some people didn't try to build anything and instead used bushes or holes that were left open. For farming to work, you had to have a lot of different animals, and the manure could only be piled up. A lot of people also kept stacks of buffalo chips outside their homes to get ready for winter. During the summer, this trash smelled terrible. Plus, flies and mosquitoes would come to it. Since most pioneers couldn't afford window screens, these bugs were inevitable in the home. A child would often be asked to swat the flies off the table during meals because there were so many of them. During the winter, poop would freeze on the seats of the outhouses and need to be removed with tools. The land wasn't exactly unclaimed. One dangerous thing about the frontier story is that it makes Native Americans seem like they are all the same, violent, and a problem that needs to be fixed. The West is also shown as a huge, empty desert that is just waiting to be explored. Though it was hard to be a pioneer, it was even harder to be a Native American in the West. They were often violently kicked off their land to make room for eager settlers. On the other hand, despite what Westerns may show, Native Americans rarely hurt settlers. Treaties and agreements were often broken, which forced tribes to live on smaller and smaller reservations and kept them from getting paid. In order to kill off Native American tribes and cut off their food source, the government even pushed for the slaughter of a lot of buffalo. When talking about how hard it is to live on the border, this fact has to be taken into account.